One of the important things to know about the battle over the ratification of the Constitution is going to sound really obvious, but I think people forget about it, and that is it wasn't inevitable that the Constitution would be ratified. It wasn't even inevitable that we would have a Constitution. So the debate over ratification generally throughout the states was a debate. It was a real battle in some states. It took a long time. It's part of the reason why the Federalist essays that we now call the Federalist Papers came about, was partly because people needed persuading. They were very worried about this new centralized government that was going to be created. And New York and Virginia were two particularly important states where this debate was taking place, and both of them were large, and both of them were prosperous, and both of them were influential in many ways. And in Virginia, there was a very active ratification debate with, on one side, James Madison kind of taking the lead, and on the other side, Patrick Henry serving a prominent role. And again, what's important to remember is it's not as though Madison was right and Henry was wrong. It was a debate. They were worried about or dealing with actual concrete issues. Henry was worried, among other things, about what now is the Bill of Rights, that there wasn't a Bill of Rights initially attached. Madison really felt that this stronger government was going to be necessary. And so that debate went on for a time with people watching, both Virginia and New York, to see what the outcome would be. So during the ratification debate over the Constitution, Marshall was a Federalist, and so he was on what now we would know as the pro-Constitution side, that really felt that the government needed to be more centralized and stronger to hold the states together. The anti-federalists at the time were the people who were worried about the power of this new government, the lack of a Bill of Rights attached to this new Constitution. So Marshall was an interesting figure throughout this period. Many people considered Virginia to be the epicenter of what comes to be known as the Jeffersonian Republicans, and Marshall is a Federalist in Virginia, which is a really interesting thing to be. It's interesting, I'm not sure if it would have been a lonely thing to be a Federalist in Virginia, but you certainly would have been noticed. I mean, I know there were other Federalists in Virginia. I know that Alexander Hamilton, when he wanted to get information spread throughout Virginia, he had one or two Federalists there that he would write these lengthy letters to. Say, here's what's really happening, and basically know that the letter would be spread around. But many people, including Hamilton, really saw Virginia as this political epicenter of opposition, and Marshall was an interesting character in that climate. One of the things that it's important to remember about politics during the 1790s in the United States is that the United States was a new nation. It was tiny. It wasn't really in any way militarily strong. And for much of the 1790s, it was being bounced back and forth between France and England. So in 1794, the Jay Treaty is signed. It's passed in 1795, but it's very controversial. It seemingly is very soft on the British, people who by that point in time are unfriendly or feeling unfriendly towards the British and are worried about the government and worried about monarchists and thinking it's too strong. These become known as Republicans or Jeffersonian Republicans or Democratic Republicans. They're really worried about this treaty representing the direction that politics is going. The Federalists are in favor of the treaty, and this becomes a really fierce debate. It sounds a little goofy to say, ooh, there was a treaty and people were in the streets protesting, but they were. It's important to realize that we often assume that foreign affairs and domestic affairs are two separate realms. But in the 1790s, there was really no difference, and there was a lot of assumption that whatever happened in the realm of relations with England or relations with France would have an enormous shaping impact on the young nation. So things like the Jay Treaty and further things down the road, relations between England and France and the United States, that was a social issue, that was a cultural issue, that was a political issue, that was an economic issue, and that's part of why all of these things become basically a big deal in the 1790s. The French Revolution had an interesting impact on the United States. So on the one hand, there was a tendency among many Americans to think, we lit the spark of liberty with the revolution. It is spreading around the world. Look, it's starting in France. So there was this assumption that the United States had done a great different thing. They were not a monarchy in a world full of monarchies. They had lit this flame of liberty. But there were other people. These tended to be Federalists like Marshall and Hamilton and ultimately Washington, who were really worried at what came to be the real social and political unrest in France. It seemed to them that that represented dangerous a dangerous lack of control, social anarchy, the overturn of authority. And so there were many people who feared contamination, basically, by the French Revolution. That became a really heated issue as well, in which some people truly thought that the government would be overturned and the nation would be swallowed up by these crazy French revolutionaries on the one hand, and on the other hand, at least for a time, they were encouraged by it. They felt that France, they were our allies during the revolution, we should stand by whatever's happening there. That was one of many really fierce debates about foreign affairs that becomes really fundamentally about American politics and American society and what kind of nation the United States would be. The XYZ affair causes what comes to be known as the quasi-war, which I suppose is truth in advertising because it's a war that's never a real war. It's essentially it's essentially a diplomatic misunderstanding that snowballs. So the French are upset that the Jay Treaty was signed and American relations with England seemed to be going swimmingly, and there seemed to be economic implications of that. And as happens throughout this period, the French do not like this, so they respond by starting to intervene with American shipping at sea. There are people sent, there's a tribunal of people sent to try and deal with this, but seemingly in France, the French demand some kind of a bribe before they will commence negotiations. Marshall is a part of that tribunal. And it comes to be called the XYZ affair because in the reports that are sent back, these three men who essentially demand a bribe are labeled as X, Y, and Z. Their names are not given. This becomes this great moment of outrage where Americans are insulted that they're being asked to pay tribute to a foreign nation, and there's great outrage. Now, it's old world, new world, so in the old world, it wouldn't have been stunningly shocking to pay what we now would see as a horrible bribe, but at that point it would have been, okay, well, here, have a little money, and now let's open negotiations. But at the time, again, the United States didn't take it that way, so it almost becomes a war. The United States starts building up the army and preparing for this quasi-war, and for one of the few times in the 1790s, the Federalist Party, Marshall's party, is getting a lot of popular appeal. There's, people cheering for President John Adams because leading the nation during this time of quasi-war. He writes in his letters, wow, this is pretty good. The American people, they like me. They really like me. It's a brief period, and it peters out, and then actually, as you would expect in the period, America then ends up being in trouble with England, and their foreign relations angst goes on. So the Louisiana Purchase was really a major, major land acquisition for the young republic, happened during Jefferson's presidency. But like so much else in this period, it ends up seeming really partisan, partly because the Federalists, it represents the nation potentially spreading very far west. On the one hand, I think Americans assume always that they're going to keep spreading west, but many Federalists are concerned that that kind of spread is going to decentralize the government, it's going to chip away at the center. They're not necessarily comfortable with that degree of spread in what feels like potentially an uncontrolled manner. So that becomes a partisan issue. It's also, interestingly, a moment when Jefferson, who always in the past, certainly in the 1790s, was a strict constructionist on the Constitution, you have to stick to the letter of the Constitution, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that the United States government can purchase a vast amount of land like that. And he even discusses with Madison, do we need a constitutional amendment for this? Because maybe we shouldn't be doing this. But he goes ahead and actually does that purchase. Now, for the Republicans and for Jeffersonians, what's wonderful about that purchase is they really see the United States as an agrarian republic. And what the Louisiana Purchase gives them is seemingly a vast amount of land that they foresee Americans just continually creating small farm after small farm, not, of course, thinking about the Native Americans who are already on many of these lands, but it seems like it's going to preserve and allow for this agrarian republic that they want. There are so many things about the early republic that we take for granted and assume. One of them is, well, of course the United States would spread across the continent of North America. That makes sense. It's only a matter of time, which is not the case. As a republic rather than a monarchy, there was already concern when it just started that even just being along the eastern seaboard, basically. Like, can that kind of a nation that's not a monarchy really hold together as a republic? Is that possible? There's a reason why the American experiment was considered an experiment. So the wide spread that was made possible by the Louisiana Purchase logically led some people to wonder what that meant. Can a republic survive that kind of spread, that kind of dispersal of its peoples? Again, it seems kind of obvious to us, but it certainly was not obvious at the time. Aaron Burr had a tangled relationship with Thomas Jefferson. Now, Aaron Burr's politics were sometimes difficult to interpret. He seemed sometimes to lean in one direction, sometimes to lean in another direction. He is most involved with Thomas Jefferson, obviously, during the election of 1800 and Jefferson's first term when he's serving as vice president. He had a lot to do with Jefferson's victory. He really pushed for Jefferson in New York and did all kinds of creative politicking on Jefferson's behalf. However, the election of 1800 ended up being a tie between Burr and Jefferson. Again, nowadays that doesn't seem possible, but because you didn't have tickets of people at that point, you had an election, and whoever got the most votes was president, and whoever got the second most was vice president, regardless of party. So in this case, two people from the same party are tied. It's very hard to break the tie. Burr didn't back down and say, oh, no, I didn't mean to be president, I should be vice president. He just allowed this situation to play out, which bred a lot of distrust on the part of Jefferson and his allies. So they didn't get along really during Jefferson's presidency, per se. Burr seemed to many people, and now at this point Jefferson too, like someone that wasn't trustworthy, that someone who his loyalties weren't clear. So by the end of Jefferson's presidency, it's pretty clear that Aaron Burr is not going to be invited for a second term as vice president, and that's when he really turns to New York state politics. So Aaron Burr, having not engaged swimmingly with Thomas Jefferson during Jefferson's first term, national politics is now not looking as though it's going to be his great frontier. So then he turns to New York state politics. Okay, I'm going to actually run for governor of New York. New arena, new direction, different kind of power, and that's where he gives his energies. Now, Alexander Hamilton in New York, he's no longer Secretary of the Treasury, but he's there in New York, prominent Federalist, is not really excited about the idea of Aaron Burr taking this position. So he really comes forward and opposes it, and in the end, it's Hamilton's opposition and Burr's running for that office that ultimately leads to the duel that killed Hamilton. So after the duel, Burr goes into hiding briefly because he just killed Alexander Hamilton, and some Federalists are very upset by this. He finishes his term as vice president, and now the national arena is no longer looking promising for him. New York state politics is no longer looking promising to him. So now he turns his attention west and sees that clearly as some kind of new frontier, that maybe he can find a way to have some degree of power, to have some degree of influence, to find a place where he can have some importance and engage again in leadership and politics. The War of 1812 is one of these series of events that happened between the United States and England and France, where the United States bounces back between the two. So the War of 1812, first there had been France and the United States in the quasi-war banging up against each other, and then, of course, the next problem becomes the United States and Britain in the War of 1812. The British are intervening with American shipping. It becomes something that seemingly can't be resolved in any way. The Republicans, the Jeffersonians, are in power. They're doing a variety of things during the War of 1812 and the lead up to it to punish the British, which has a huge impact on New England commerce in one way or another. New England still is kind of the center of the Federalist Party, so there are a lot of really peeved, potentially economically suffering Federalists in New England who don't like the Jefferson administration, who worry that New England and the Federalists are going to be just cut out of power, and who begin to really talk about what it makes sense to do in this climate. And in the end, a number of them decide that they're going to get together and create essentially some kind of a petition noting their grievances and asking for change, which becomes, among some, discussion of secession, New England secession. There isn't direct action taken to do that, But the chatter is that that's what it's about. And obviously, that has huge consequences for the Federalist Party. They end up being accused of treason and disloyalty. Unfortunately for them, they're doing this right as the war is coming to a close. Andrew Jackson has a big victory at the Battle of New Orleans, and then the Federalists march in and say, we hate this and we're threatening secession. It's very bad timing. So although the Federalists don't immediately poof disappear at that moment, it hurts their national reputation and it helps lead to their decline. So the Second Bank of the United States, like the First Bank of the United States, was controversial for a couple of reasons. Number one, it represented this centralized financial power seemingly given to the national government. To many people, that was a bad thing. That just seemed like concentrating too much economic and social elite power, giving privilege to some and entrenching it within the system. So it led many people to think it was not a favorable thing. It would be better to disperse that power. Also, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the national government can create a bank. So to some people, it was inherently unconstitutional and represented the kind of extension of national power for the government that was very nervous-making for people at the time. Supporters of the bank, to defend it, among other things, focused on the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution, which basically says that the government can do what is necessary and proper to achieve the ends that are constitutional. And so the assumption there, and Alexander Hamilton steps forward and really makes this argument in a strong way during Washington's presidency, the argument there is, well, okay, it might not say explicitly in the Constitution, yes, the national government can create a bank. However, all of the things that that bank is going to do, managing money, helping funds circulate during time of war, being particularly useful, which Madison finds it during the War of 1812, none of those things are unconstitutional. So it comes to be known as broad construction of the Constitution or loose interpretation of the Constitution. And the bank is a great example of that in practice. But you can see how people who are worried about the national government having too much power are not necessarily thrilled with this way of making the government have even more power than it has seemingly on paper. Andrew Jackson comes into power promoting a number of ideas. He comes in as sort of the defender of the white common man. And he's the common man's president, and he's a defender of small government. He doesn't like things like a big centralized national bank that represents all of the money men and big government things that make him nervous and that he's, at least in his rhetoric, promoting as being bad. So as far as the ideology that he's promoting, what he stands for as a president, it represents everything that's the opposite of who he wants to be. So he comes in as a kind of charismatic leader who people are supporting partly for, in a general sense, what he represents rather than for one or another very specific policy. And the bank is kind of a slap at what he represents as a politician. So he really, really opposes it. There's a really comical story that someone tells about John Quincy Adams, who was joking about Jackson and his hatred of the bank. And Adams says, there's an old joke about one person who calls someone else stupid and keeps being dunked in water and comes up for air and says, no, you're stupid, and gets dunked in water and brought up, no, you're stupid. And Adams says, this is Jackson with the bank. Like, even when his head's underwater, his hands will be gesturing, I hate the bank. That was serious hatred. The 1790s was a really intense, passionate, and often unpleasant decade. I mean, I think when Americans think about those moments in history generally, they don't go back to the late 1790s, but that was, in some sense, a crazy kind of period with people making wild charges and conspiracy theories and rioting of various sorts in the street and people talking about civil war and anarchy. There are other times in American history when that's happened. Part of the reason for that is you have to remember that the United States isn't even 10 years old by that point. People really don't know what kind of nation it's going to be, or, even more significant, if it's going to survive at all. We take for granted that, of course, everything's going to be okay, but there are no of courses. at that period in time. So people are very passionate and intense about their politics and very passionate and intense about denouncing and destroying their opponent, who seem to be promoting something that's going to destroy the republic. Nowadays, we take partisan opposition for granted. Of course, one party smacks at the other party, and that's the way politics worked. At the time, they thought that people of different politics would bang up against each other, and in the end, something would be decided. They didn't anticipate what we now take as organized political parties. So part of what happens in the late 1790s is Federalists and Republicans kind of cohering in some ways, and people becoming alarmed at that very fact, in addition to the things that are causing them to become party-like. So it kind of builds on itself. It's a really frantic, angry moment in American history, and the election of 1800 becomes crucially important because people are watching to see what that suggests about where the nation's going to go and how drastic action they should take to deal with however that election turns out. One of the interesting things about the War of 1812 is that one of the sides, the Federalists, are really, really aggressively anti-war. As a party, their identity was partly bound up with the British. They also economically and in every other way felt that it was really important to maintain ties with the British. So to them, it was the height of irresponsibility to really be engaging in warfare with the British. There was no sense to them of that. So it felt as though it was violating their ideology, their principles, potentially even attacking their significance in the Union, maybe not really helping trade in New England, a lot of which was taking place with Great Britain. So on many, many levels, the Federalists were very uncomfortable and ultimately outraged at what appeared to be happening during the War of 1812. Slavery is the ever-present and ever-invisible issue. It's everywhere. The nation is built on slavery. However, no one wants to talk about it in the realms of the national government because it is literally a deal breaker of one sort or another. So there's moment after moment after moment when someone steps forward and raises the issue, or people petition, or there's a member of Congress who feels very strongly about it. And in one way or another, that person is not necessarily shut down, but the issue is pushed aside. You know, now we call some of these decisions compromises, right? That there's a compromise made on the issue of slavery, and now everything's going to be great and the nation's going to hang together. The fact of the matter is, if you think about it, compromising on the issue of slavery in the long view doesn't seem likely to work. It's an institution that's grounded on inhumanity and economics tied together. But in this period, the nation's expanding, and as it expands, every new state raises the issue, is this going to be a state where slavery is allowed or not? So at the same time, everyone is really, or many people are trying not to talk about it, it's constantly at the center of debate. In the 1790s, there weren't yet what we now think about as organized political parties, but you did have two very different views of what the United States should be. On the Federalist side, they wanted a centralized national government that could sort of control affairs in an organized kind of a way. They looked towards Europe, particularly England, and as a kind of model of economic responsibility and social ideals, an aristocracy, people sort of knowing where they belong in society. The other side of the frame would become the Republicans. They really were much more eager for an agrarian republic, not centralized. The states would maintain much of the power. The national government would largely be about dealing with foreign affairs more than anything else. They had an extremely, almost diametrically opposed view of what the nation should be. The Federalists thought about industry, they thought about cities, the Republicans thought about yeoman farmers out being responsible for their own land and coming together during time of war and then dispersing and going back to their farms. Two fundamentally different visions, really easy to look at them and say, really? Yeoman farmers? But there's no reason why at that point that couldn't have been correct. There were no or few obvious right answers at the time. And although at times the Federalists seemed to be the right answer because they appear to us more modern, everything was far cloudier at that particular moment, and there were no of courses. You have to have the contingency in that time period to really understand what everyone was so passionate about. You would think that Virginia, being rural in one way or another, and certainly being farm-based, or what we now call plantation-based, would be uniformly Republican and Jeffersonian. And the fact of the matter is, some Federalists referred to Jefferson and his friends as the Virginia Junto, right? So there is some degree to which they thought it's the Southerners, it's Virginians, we hate that. However, there were people in Virginia who believed, along with other constitutional Federalists, that the government needed to be stronger, who had a view of the nation that agreed with other Federalists. Simply because they lived in a place that was largely agricultural doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't have a similar vision for what the nation should be, and even more fundamentally, what the government should be. In some ways, serving in the Revolutionary War, being in the Continental Army, was a kind of nationalist-making machine. Because the fact of the matter was, if you in any way were at the center of combat, what you saw was the Congress not being very efficient at doing what it needed to do during a time of war. So you have people like Hamilton, like Washington, certainly the people at headquarters. They emerge from the war thinking, holy smoke, like that really didn't work. Whatever we have, it should be stronger in some way. So it's interesting that, in a sense, it makes sense that if you fight in the Revolutionary War, you are thinking in a national kind of a way. But it's a bond, a military bond, a social bond, and I think an ideological bond about what government should or shouldn't be and what doesn't work, and what it means for that kind of lack of function to persist. And what happens partly in the 1780s is people who are already thinking the government needs to be stronger see signs of things happening that suggest to them, uh-oh, just what we dreaded is happening. Things are coming apart. The government isn't strong enough to deal with things. We need to come together and empower it. The war, for a time, did bond people from different states. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't loyalists and that there isn't division, but people came together during time of war, as people do during time of war, as the war was going on. But when the war ended, people sort of went back to their own states and no longer had that shared energy and vision. So part of the horrible lessons of the 1780s after the war was, oh, wait a minute. We were kind of cooperating reasonably well during the Revolution. Where'd that go? That kind of isn't present anymore. And that's the decade that leads up to the Constitutional Convention. So the Federalists in the early 19th century are faced with a situation where it's clear that they dominated and were the majority in the 1790s, now not so much. And it appears it's unclear whether they're going to be in that kind of political majority again. But they don't necessarily say, oh, well, our time is done. They find other ways to maintain a hold on power. One of those ways is through the judiciary. They try and sort of plant themselves throughout the judiciary so that they're still shaping what the nation is. They're still shaping law, and thus they're still shaping society. They also try and maintain their hold on education, to instill heads of universities, to control what people are learning. Yale University, the president of Yale University, is very aggressive about breeding good Federalists at Yale, teaches them, apparently he taught rhetoric to some Yale students, and his examples would be things like, to the students, and we have student notebooks that have survived, which is how we know this. He would say, okay, students, imagine there's a rabid French-loving man as president. And the students would write down, rabid French-loving man as president. So in one way or another, culturally, socially, and judicially, Federalists were still trying to maintain a hold on power.